who doesn't know, to start with, for everybody that doesn't know me, my name is Frank Gafa, and I'm a Wawa Wiradjuri man, and I currently live down on Boomerang country here in my part of Melbourne. And I just want to acknowledge all the Kulin nations, and also acknowledge the Wadawurrung, on whose land I also work, because I work down in Geelong quite a lot. And I also just want to acknowledge all the lands that people are on today, and elders past and present, and just acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room, along with Denisha and Janara, who are joining for the conversation today. So first of all, just some housekeeping, just for everybody joining if it's your first ANU online event. If anybody in the audience has any questions, all you need to do is use the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. And if you just submit a question, one of the moderators might pick it up towards the end of the event to ask the two speakers. So if you've got a question, please put it through. Any question is a good question, especially when we're talking politics and the upcoming election. If you have any questions about technical issues, all you need to do is email alumni@anu.edu.au, and somebody will get back to you with some help. Also, if you wish to remain anonymous when you're sort of interacting or submitting any questions, you can submit questions anonymously. So just keep that in mind as well. And lastly, just a note that this is a forum provided by the ANU to have a conversation about the election, but the ANU doesn't necessarily endorse, or the conversations and opinions don't represent the views of the ANU, but we're extremely excited to have a conversation with two Indigenous women leading into the election. So today's conversation, it's a very interesting time. Tomorrow is the budget, and within potentially the fortnight, the election might be called. And so ANU Alumni Week actually falls in a very interesting time where we actually might be into an election this week. And so I'm very, very excited and honoured to have two people I know as well through my time at the ANU and in Canberra generally. So first of all, we have Denisha Duff. Denisha is a proud First Nations woman born on Thursday Island in the Torres Strait, and has significantly contributed to improving the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through 20 years of working in health, and is now running for the House of Representatives seat of Bowman in Queensland for the Australian Labor Party. And we also have Dr. Janara Garang, who is a Waka Waka woman, academic, former public servant, and proud grandmother. As both a unionist and a public sector whistleblower, she has learned that standing up for what is right can be tough at the best of times, and that is why she's running for the Australian Greens for the Senate in the ACT. So first of all, I've done a little bit of an introduction, but I would really love to just hear from you both, just to sort of introduce yourself a bit more, and also talk about why you're running in the election. And so maybe if we start with you, Janara, just to say a few words on yourself and why you're running.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank, and hello, Denisha. It's nice to see you. We're all long-term friends. I think we've known each other for 5+ years, probably much longer. I'm here on the Ngunnawal country, Ngambri country in the ACT. So I honour and thank the ancestors of this place and all the current elders in this place for allowing us to live and work on their country. And to all of you and all the countries that you're on in this great continent of ours, I thank their ancestors as well. So I'm an alumni from 2018, did my PhD for 7 years at ANU, and I did it at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research. I absolutely loved it. I'm not sure I understand people who think it's really hard to do a PhD. Mind you, I didn't do much for the first 2 years because I didn't have a clue what I was doing. But by the time I got to the end of it, it was just the most fantastic, wonderful journey. So I did mine on sacred leadership and how Aboriginal culture creates sacred and visionary elders, because I work in the area of transformational leadership and have for the last 10 or so years, as well as teaching and doing a bit of research in that area. So I'm a grandmother and a mother of girls, actually, and I've lived in Ngunnawal country since 1978. As Frank said, I had a long career as a public servant, and whistleblowing put an end to that career, of course. So that's another story that you can read on Google anytime you want. I'm sure you'll find that interesting. I'm running for the Greens because they pre-selected me. And I'm enjoying this journey of being in the Senate campaign here. We've only got 2 seats in the ACT, so it makes it very interesting with the numbers of people that are actually running, some independents, Liberals and Labor. And my background is that I'm a Waka Waka Woolly Woolly woman from the Jawan Jumbi Nation of central Queensland. I was born in the west of Queensland in a place called Longreach, a very racist town. I was born in the late 50s, so I'm in my 60s now. And, you know, I've had the same life as most of us have had as Aboriginal people in the colonial dominant culture. And that's been an amazing and interesting journey, actually, when I look at it. So I started my activism as a teenager, with my mother being quite involved in community land rights in Queensland and in community issues like housing and other things. And then when I came to Canberra in the late 70s, I got very involved in working for our new national Aboriginal organisations. And so I married somebody who is in the press gallery, or was in his career, and is now retired. So I've been around politics in Canberra a very long time through activism, but also through, you know, understanding it from that point of view. And I find it fascinating and interesting, and I actually really enjoy it. But I'm in it because I want to do I think it's time to transform Australia for all of us. So that's me and my background. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Janara. It's always, yeah, I've known you for a long time as well. It's always really interesting to hear you talk about what you've been through in your life, and also the experiences you've had, especially around politics in Canberra. And so, yeah, I wish you luck, because I think you'd be a fantastic addition to the Senate. Denisha, did you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and talk about why you're running?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Janara, for that, for your story. I always find it fascinating when you've known someone to actually hear their story and what drives them. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am. I'm on Cornamuka country, beautiful Moreton Bay, just outside of Brisbane on the coast. My family have lived here for over 30 years. I'm originally from the Torres Strait. I was born up on Thursday Island and started school up there, but obviously because of, you know, my parents seeking better opportunities for us, we moved to the mainland and ended up in Brisbane, where I've sort of lived on and off. I've done 2 stints in Canberra, so Canberra is kind of like my second home. I've been down there a couple of times. I graduated from ANU in 2013 with a Masters of Business Administration. So absolutely loved being in the College of Business and Economics. It was just such an amazing time to be there. And it was during that time that I was studying as well too. I put my hand up to work in politics. The Labor government under Rudd and Gillard had actually established a portfolio for Indigenous health. So with my background in Indigenous health, I put my hand up to be the Indigenous health advisor to Warren Snowden, who was the first minister for that portfolio. And I found that was an absolutely fascinating journey, a great opportunity to actually, you know, impact policy development and shape, you know, a new partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. After I graduated, I moved back to Brisbane. I've been working in the Aboriginal community control health sector for, you know, it's been on and off over 15 years now. And it really is, I mean, that's what drives me to put my hand up for politics. It's around, you know, really mobilising grassroots and ensuring that your policy meets the needs of communities, and that's the best way to do it. And given my experience in politics, I feel like it's time to step up as an Indigenous woman and have your voice heard. I'm also in the electorate of Bowman, which is kind of infamously known by the current incumbent, who's been there 18 years, whose, you know, behaviour is infamous, and yeah, it's time for him to leave.
Yeah, it's and I think your experience, especially with the last few years with the pandemic, and also with the natural disasters that have occurred and the health implications that have come out of that, I think your experience in Parliament would be very valuable, and more women and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Parliament is what we really need to have some actual proper representation. But we might stick with you, Denisha, because I'd really like to ask a question about the pandemic and get the views of you both. And I guess your experience in health over a number of decades. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how the government has responded to that, and what you think the government could have done and could be doing better into the future. And I guess specifically also about how things have been in Queensland as well with the response to the pandemic.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Operations Officer currently for the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health. We're a regional Aboriginal community control organisation that pretty much covers most of Southeast Queensland. So our clinics span from Caboolture down to the border, across to Laidley, Ipswich, if you know the area, and then also the Southern Moreton Bay Islands, including North Stradbroke Island. So it's a huge population. It's a growing population. There's estimated to be, and CAPA estimated there's probably going to be about 100,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living here in the next couple of years. It's one of the fastest growing populations. So for us at AUI, it was pretty significant that we were on the front foot to protecting our communities, knowing that the burden of disease is quite significant with a lot of our families who are overcrowded as well too in communities here. And what we found was that it was just so slow and delayed. There was mixed messages. There wasn't any cut through to our communities. Certainly they were pushing out mainstream messages, but our mob weren't listening. And there was a lot of confusion. We, as part of my organisation, we set up respiratory clinics just to ensure that our mob can actually get tested if they were sick. So that we could actually maintain our clinics as clean spaces. So if you were still unwell and needed to see a doctor, you could still go and see the doctor. There were issues around access to vaccines, and just the criteria for prioritising our mob was just confusing for our communities. We set up a call centre so that our communities could call in and actually talk to us about where they go to access vaccinations, when they can. And any of the side effects. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety around actually stepping up for the vaccine. Access to PPE was pretty appalling as well too. With both of the vaccines and the PPE, we had to rely on the state government to actually, to start off, to actually give us some pretty consistent supply. And now we're facing very similar issues with boosters. It's a bit of a slow uptake with our communities in terms of, needing to go get a booster, and the 5 to 12-year-olds, still not as high as we'd like it to be. So, at the end of the day, it's been, the federal government's been pretty slow and delayed in reacting. And, the initial thought wasn't around protecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That was something that we had to do ourselves to make sure that our community was protected. And we've had some really good immunisation uptake, engagement in Southeast Queensland now as well too. So we're pretty happy that our communities, getting the message and doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, you mentioned there about the work that you've been doing that, the government probably should have done better, and it's definitely an experience that's been reported on widely across Australia, where Aboriginal medical services have really done the bulk of the heavy lifting in communities. I know down here in Victoria, I think Aboriginal people for the first dose of the vaccine were one of the fastest to take it up, and I think a lot of that work was because of the Aboriginal medical services here in Victoria. So yeah, definitely really important work, and thank you for explaining that to us as well, because I think a lot of people heard about the pandemic in Victoria and New South Wales, but not a lot of what was actually happening other places in Australia. And Janara, for yourself, living in the ACT, very interesting being surrounded by New South Wales, and I'm interested to hear your experience in the pandemic and with the government response. Obviously, it's complicated by the ACT having to sort of dance around what New South Wales is doing and certain outbreaks in New South Wales. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what you think about the pandemic response in the ACT in particular.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's good to hear what happened up there, Denisha, actually, because there were so many First Nations communities around the country that were so affected and some so left behind, weren't there?
Mm.
So here in the ACT, it seems like, all I can tell you is such a good story. And it's probably because we are the ACT that, we're a small state or small territory, and things can be well managed by the government here. And actually, I found my personal experience was that they were really well managed from the government perspective, putting into place all the things they needed to put in place. There's thousands of public servants here, so most people worked from home, and it just seemed to run very, very smoothly. Although being surrounded by New South Wales, if you lived in Queanbeyan or you lived in Yass, every time you went across the border, there was a change of rules. So for people who had to do that, that was really annoying and often really hard, because there would be, there'd be police roadblocks and so on the main roads going out into Queanbeyan and out into Yass. And my daughter actually lived in Queanbeyan, so I would have to go back and forth because I was helping with the granddaughter, and that was really confusing, because there'd be a different rule in the ACT and a completely different rule in New South Wales. And it's still actually a bit confusing, even though it's sort of stopped now. We'd be walking around going, oh, do we have to wear masks today? Oh no, that's only in Queanbeyan. We don't have to do that. Oh no, you have to do that in the ACT now. And then the COVID rules around childcare and educational stuff for schools were different between the two states. But I have to say the ACT government, of which the Greens are part, of course, was very efficient. I found them very efficient, very manageable. They got on top of things really, really quick. They kept everybody really informed, and like most states were doing. But I think because we were smaller, we had a smaller population, and also the First Nations response was really great. Our medical service was on top of everything. We could go straight in, especially those who over the age of 55 were called. Our medical service called us up and said, you need to come in for your COVID jab. And they just kept that response going. And it was really easy to just go straight into Anunga, get your COVID vaccines, 1, 2, 3. And there didn't seem to be any issue. And so I kind of feel bad saying that to the rest of Australia, that it was really easy and not very hard living in the ACT while that was going on. I know, of course, for businesses, that was not easy. All of it was very, very difficult for those people who are in small businesses here, and the impact on that is still being seen in all parts of the economy in the ACT. But I think that I have to say that the government response was really good and manageable, and it says a lot about some of the things we need actually in managing natural disasters and managing other things in the whole of the country, to look at a small territory that can actually do a response properly and responsively for their citizens. Mm.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at the way the different jurisdictions handled the pandemic. And I know down here in Victoria as well, we had quite heavy restrictions, which I think and accept that they were definitely needed. But one of the things you mentioned, Janara, about the policing, it's something that's been a lot of commentary on around how policing was used in certain points of the pandemic where other sort of health responses could have and should have been used. And I think it's really interesting when you talk about the border crossing. And for me, and I know me as an Aboriginal person, I found it quite intimidating when we had 5 kilometre limits here in Victoria, and I had to sort of negotiate with police pretty much everywhere I went. And so I can't imagine what it would be like for people in that situation, going to and from Queanbeyan, having to sort of negotiate with a police officer every time they were going to work, for instance. So I think it's really interesting to acknowledge that as well. So on to our next question. I think you both as women, hopefully entering Parliament, I want to just have a conversation about the increasing commentary of the boys' club in politics and Parliament at the moment, and the very real challenges that women are facing in Parliament. Obviously, with the reports of quite serious things occurring to both politicians and advisors within the federal Parliament over the last couple of years. I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on that, potentially heading into Parliament, but also to ask whether or not that has actually been a motivation for you to run as well, seeing that all unfold over the last couple of years. So maybe we've got to Denisha first.
Yeah, I guess I'm not as intimidated by the thought of that. Obviously, I've worked in as an advisor in Parliament before for a number of years. That was probably about over 10 years ago now. But yeah, the Labor Party have got a 50% quota for females being pre-selected. So we've got some awesome women who are stepping up, you know, for pre-selection now and are running as candidates. I guess one of the other things that, you know, gives me comfort as a First Nations woman is that we have an Indigenous caucus. So that consists of, you know, existing First Nations MPs, senators who are part of that, but also, you know, those that are interested in supporting. And it is really around, you know, having someone who's a mentor or a champion or a supporter with you inside there. One of the other things that sort of assisted me along the way is I did the Pathways to Politics for Women course. So, you know, that really does, you know, build up your confidence and skill to actually navigate those kind of issues as well too. So for me, it's not a scary thought. You know, you hear the rumours, you just, you know, it's the same sort of situation across corporate issues as well too. Probably not as, you know, not as advanced in terms of addressing those issues that happened in there, but yeah, definitely feeling okay with heading into it, knowing what's there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think you probably benefit of having worked in and around politics previously, that you sort of know the players as well, I assume.
Yeah, definitely. It's the network that's already there.
Yeah. And Janara, what about yourself?
Yeah, look, it doesn't bother me at all. I've had, I think, since about 1978, been involved in stuff in and around Parliament House. And I'm really aware, actually, it's really surprised me that it's taken so long for this to come out in the public mind. This was going on back in the 80s. There was lots of things happening to women in Parliament House that was just kept quiet. No? Nobody ever said anything about it, did anything about it. And, you know, it takes another 20, 40 years for it to emerge into the public domain. So, yeah, my understanding of it is just this is such a reflection of the place that people feel they can get away with anything, particularly, you know, the privileged white males, I guess. Let's make it clear that that's who we're talking about. As an older Aboriginal woman, I don't have any issues around being around men. And for many, many years, you know, in our community, we have a much better relationship, I think, with men than they do in white culture. It's a much more, well, a stronger relationship where women get to have power and be able to say their piece back at men and talk, you know, in that relationship. So I don't have an issue with white men straight back at them. I do have trouble with the way in which they behave towards any woman, and that's just totally not acceptable. It's not acceptable anywhere. It just surprises me that the rest of Australia had no idea that this has actually been going on, well, probably since the beginning of Parliament, but it's happened to me as the wife of a member of the press gallery, you know, sitting in Parliament House waiting for my husband to come down from the press gallery and getting, you know, propositioned by ministers while I'm sitting there waiting, you know, as a young woman in my 20s and in my 30s. So it's pretty atrocious. And there's lots of stories that one could tell, which one won't tell. But it's a horrible environment. It's a hothouse environment. And every woman should be able to work safely wherever they are. Every person, every human, regardless of their gender or their anything, they should be able to go to work, be treated respectfully. And I think, you know, in our party, we've got a very strong First Nations network. We all support each other. We've had history in our party of things happening, of course, but they've been dealt with very quickly. And we've got a lot of things in place now that we don't expect that any of that sort of stuff should happen ever again. And we've got a very strong women's contingent in the Greens, which would just not tolerate that. And our values and our principles would not tolerate that kind of behaviour. So people are very fast to deal with it in our political party. And I would imagine that we would do that very clearly in anything that happened to anyone in Parliament House. You know, standing up in the Senate, standing up in the House of Reps, wherever we are, to just ensure that never happens to any human being.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we're having this conversation, and Australia in general is having this conversation, and that the conversation is still ongoing going into the election as well, because the worry I think a lot of people have is that, you know, these conversations start and then the election gets called and we move on to policies. And we don't actually talk about the fact that the Parliament is a workplace for people, both people who work for the ministers and the senators, and also the members of Parliament themselves. And so, yeah, I'm actually, it's upsetting to read a lot of the things that people have gone through, but it's, I think, really a good thing that we're having the conversation, and hopefully the next term of Parliament will at least be an improvement. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that, both of you. It's as I said at the top of the chat, it's always interesting hearing from people who've also been involved in politics for a very long time about your perspective on how things are going and how your parties are dealing with it as well. So moving on to the next question. So I want to ask about the natural sort of disasters and the sort of effects of climate change on those things over the last couple of years. There's been both bushfires and recently floods, and still ongoing torrential rain. I was in New South Wales on the weekend, and I can tell you the rain is still just really, really coming down there, and it's actually quite a worry that floods will again happen in the not too distant future. And so I'm interested to hear what you both think about the government's response to climate change in general, but also the government's response to protecting people from potential natural disasters, and also just the response to the bushfires that happened in 2020, and also now with the ongoing floods and the cleanup from the floods. And I guess you both, you know, Denisha, you being in Queensland at the moment with the floods affecting communities quite heavily, and Janara, I know I visited Canberra during the bushfires in 2020, and there were times where you literally couldn't leave your house in Canberra because the smoke was so thick. And if you didn't have a well-ventilated house, the smoke would just seep into your house. And so I know you both have had quite intimate interactions with the effects of both those natural disasters. So Denisha, again, we might go to you first to maybe just talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So to your first question about my thoughts on the federal government, I think it's appalling. I think they've, you know, should have done a lot more, a lot quicker, and a lot more equitable. You know, Brisbane, and it's literally only, you know, last month, I think, or earlier this month, was, you know, absolutely devastated some parts of Brisbane. You know, houses were under, people have lost everything. You know, they weren't insured because it was, you know, 2011, the floods, it was nearly as bad as the 2011 floods that hit Brisbane. You know, it's completely devastating northern New South Wales, and we've got rain here again, and people are sandbagging already. You know, concerned about what's going to happen, you know, down at the end of the week when we've had, you know, a couple of weeks of pure rain. So for us, it's about reacting fast. But then, you know, it's all well and good to have really good you know, programs to build dams and walls and levees and that sort of stuff. But the bigger question is around climate change, you know, because we're just putting a band-aid over it if we don't actually address climate change in the longer term.
Yeah, thank you, Denisha. Yeah, and I think the evidence is in, and the commentary is quite strong about the fact that climate change is a big contributor to these disasters occurring. So a very, very important point. And Janara, what about you?
Well, you know, I believe, and the Greens believe, that the Liberals are a complete embarrassment internationally and nationally around their policy to do with climate response and climate action. It was very clear before COP26 and during and after just how atrocious their policies are and how appallingly they just have no consideration. I don't know if they're all in denial about climate change or the need for real climate action or what's going on, but for them to go over to something like COP26 and just not be prepared, not be ready, to have this embarrassing relationship with the media and the press and everybody else in the country who were, you know, begging them as their representatives to produce something appropriate for Australia to be speaking about internationally. And well, they're just appalling. We should just get rid of them because they have no idea what they're doing. They don't care enough. And you know, my feeling is that in Australia, we don't do emergency response very well. I mean, when it happens, the reaction and the way in which people do that is excellent, but we don't plan ahead. We don't have an emergency response to everything we know is going to happen to this climate. First Nations people know what this country has been doing for thousands and thousands of years. It has this pattern where it does these kinds of things. It's like non-Indigenous people and scientists, because they don't ask us, they have no idea. That's the first thing. And then, you know, we tell them how to manage it, how to look after it. And it's like some novel idea, as if the science is more important. But emergency response needs to be much more clearly handled. It needs to be centrally handled at a Commonwealth and federal level. The Prime Minister had initiated a fund for managing these kind of things, which I understand now has got huge millions of dollars in this fund that's not being invested in emergency response, that's not assisting. And just looking at the latest emergency in Lismore and northern New South Wales and the southeast of Brisbane, it's very clear that nobody's coordinating anything. So how can we operate a response as a nation when there's this state government there, that state government there, the local councils, and nobody's talking to each other, and the federal government isn't using the fund or the money that it has to actually do this in a good way? So I think one of our major things that we have to start thinking about over the next almost immediately is how are we going to manage climate action in terms of doing it now on the ground in Australia, not just talking politically, internationally. All of those things are very important. We have all our policies around renewables and other things, but how are we going to look after people when there's floods and fires? How are we going to look after people's lives and livelihoods and the loss of those things? That's really important. We can't just bring the army in at the last minute. We have to have this more planned, well planned, 5-10 years ahead. You know, this is what they do in China and other countries. It's a sensible way of operating when you live in a country like Australia that has this environment that has been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. And ask First Nations people how to do that well. We all know how to do that well. We've known for generations. It's time to do that. The arrogance of white privilege of a dominant culture is ruining our ability to actually work better in this space. That's my response.
Very, very important. I think it's again good to acknowledge that the response to a lot of these natural disasters have actually come from community, and Aboriginal organisations have been the ones stepping up, especially in Lismore at the moment, with responses to the disaster and raising money for community and mob who need housing and clothing and food. A lot of that has come from Aboriginal organisations, and it's also, I think, important to point out that reports over the last few months about the effects of climate change show that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are going to be affected first and more violently by climate change as well. Rural communities with the increasing heat. The increasing heat and the housing that's not up to keep people safe from that increasing heat, and also in the Torres Straits as well with the rising sea levels. So a really important conversation for us to have. So it looks like we do have a question, a couple of questions actually from the audience. I'm just having a look. So we might just move on to some questions from the audience, and then I do have some other questions if we need. All right, we might go to a question from Sam first. How can we better involve Indigenous voices in these key conversations about climate change? Maybe Denisha, if you want to go first.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I went over to Straddie and met with local traditional owners over there. So, and they actually, through their TO corporation, manage their country. So, you know, a very important voice and very important capability in terms of, you know, the backburning on the island, because the island was on fire a couple of years ago, just through lightning strikes. So they're funded by the federal government to actually manage land and sea. So, you know, that's an important recognition that needs to continue, because, you know, while we have native title across, you know, a lot of natural bushland, and certainly, you know, my country's up in Cape York, you need a workforce with the knowledge to actually manage that as well too. So I think it's more than just voices, it's about action and recognising where the knowledge is held.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I know, Jenna, you just said a bit about that, but is there anything you'd like to add onto that? Or you're just on mute at the moment?
Unmute because my phone was ringing. Apologies, people. I've got
That's all right.
Granny, when she gets home from school, she loves to FaceTime her nana. So yeah, I think as part of this whole centrally organised service response, we need to have a whole nation response that's about the way Indigenous people do it and the way in which we can do it together, and we can support all communities across our continent to do it together, using the knowledge that we have about country and land and environment. And if that was involved in this whole climate action, climate change, transformation behaviour in our country, I think that we could have a much better response to it, and people would feel less fear about it, because Aboriginal people are very good at managing the land. And when you understand how to manage our land, then you're not scared that there's going to be this bushfire, there's going to be this gigantic flood. And I remember as a child, we had lots of big floods across northern Queensland that would come down to our country, or we'd be driving to Townsville and trying to cross the Burdekin River, you know, and it was flooded. None of us we weren't afraid of these things, because we understood and knew that this was part of the way our country behaved. And so if you knew how to respond to it, and we could teach that to a lot of communities in Australia, so that they don't get freaked out by what's going on and they are able to manage. And also, it's not really wise to go building towns on the edge of rivers that flood and flood all the time.
So we have a comment. I'll take it as a comment from Michelle, because I think that we've talked about this in really detail over the last couple of minutes. But just a comment around, you know, aren't current disasters unprecedented and due to human-induced climate change? And I think from what you're both saying, I think that we definitely agree on that climate change is a huge factor in what's been happening over the last couple of years, and the increased effects of climate-induced sort of natural disasters for communities. We've got a couple of other questions. I'll just have a look. So there's a question from somebody around the APS actually. So what needs to be done so we have more Indigenous people holding senior positions in the APS? I'm not sure who wants to take that question first.
Can I go first?
Yes, you can, Janara, of course.
Well, this has been a story since the 1980s, having Aboriginal people in the public sector in places other than Indigenous affairs, firstly, and then in places that isn't at the APS 4, 6, 3, 2, 1 level. So that's been going on since EEO came in the 80s. And, you know, part of me looks at it, you know, when I think about it from the work that I do as a consultant around transforming systems, there's a lot of systemic cultural racism issues. There's a lot of systemic stuff that likes people and attitudes that like to keep Aboriginal people in a certain place in bureaucracies, or people of colour, people of anything of difference. The dominant culture does like to maintain control and be in charge. And you know, that is not going to change if we don't start transforming the way people think and the attitudes they have to people of difference in the whole country. So this is just an ongoing thing that happens. It seems to happen every generation. You know, in our generation, when we were in our 20s, Charlie Perkins was sending us out to work in other parts of the public sector so that all those Migloo white people would see black faces. And it was hard. It was hard work because it was just very difficult at that time. And then the next generation were doing the same thing because we were all being kept, you know, to that black ceiling was there flat right on top of you. So, you know, you could never get up to a branch secretary or a branch manager's role or even to a first assistant secretary. And it still exists. Like I find it quite appalling that it still exists here in 2022. There's, you know, there's been one or two people who've risen to Deputy Director General or, you know, a First Assistant Secretary or a Group Manager of a department. And you've just got to ask yourself the question of why? Why, when we're as qualified now, we're as educated and as smart, why is that not happening? And it's got to have something to do with dominant control, with systemic cultural behaviour and systemic racism. And there needs to be a change in that. There needs to be a group of people in the APS and the APSC who are prepared to change that and change it for the long term, not just for one generation, but for the whole future. Otherwise, we're just going to have another generation of Aboriginal young people with degrees who can't go any further, you know, than a branch secretary level.
Yeah. I'll just add a couple of more points if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I think there's been a lot of work done on this over the years. I certainly was one of those who started in the early 2000s, I think, as a graduate, and you know, as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander graduate. And one of the observations I make is it's probably about the culture. With changes of government, there's different culture established in each of the departments, and it's, you know, either culturally safe or not, or friendly or not. And you will actually see a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, regardless of what level they are, leaving because it's not a conducive or safe culturally environment where you're not recognised, you're not promoted, and that's what's going to happen. If you're serious about, you know, recognising the skill and worldview of First Nations people, then you need to actually establish a pathway, invest in it, mentor and promote our people to those levels that are required.
Thank you both for that. And it's, as of course, very interesting to hear your views of both being involved in public service for so long as well. There's a question here from Andrea, and it's about national disaster planning. And I might, hopefully Andrea, you're okay with this, but I might just make it a bit broader, just about universities in general. But the question is around how ANU could help with natural disaster planning and sort of centre Indigenous focused efforts with national disaster planning. And I guess maybe I'll just make that a bit broader about universities in general, how academia and universities could potentially support that work being done.
I had one thought, because I did read ahead on the questions. But I was thinking, ANU is so well placed. It's right next door to IATSIS. The Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. And I'm going to throw IATSIS in the mix here because I used to be a council member. But I mean, they have a wealth of network and connections and knowledge across the country. They do have the Native Title Conference every year, and they bring together all of the prescribed bodies, you know, who manage native title, who manage, you know, caring for country. So, you know, if you're looking at, you know, leveraging off the knowledge and working with people on the, you know, pretty much on their country around managing and harnessing that knowledge, then that's the place to go, I think, in terms of the first step.
I might add that when I was an assistant professor at the University of Canberra back in the mid-2000s, we established University of Canberra Siri, we called it, a bit like the Siri on your iPhone. So it was a collaborative Indigenous research initiative, which took all the researchers at the university who were involved in anything to do with Indigenous affairs, but because we had so many involved in waterways management and environmental stuff, that there was this collaboration and partnership across the faculties, across non-Indigenous researchers and Indigenous researchers, as well as reaching out to other universities to do the same thing, so that we could create a big collaborative partnership relationship between researchers that were scientists in the field as well as First Nations experts in the field. And now we've got quite a few Aboriginal people who have PhDs in their field around environment and waterways and legal issues, as well as those things that Denisha has talked about. So there's a complete system already available to just bring that collaboration and partnership together, and universities are the perfect place to do it. But I would like to still add that we have to, it's really important to challenge and check the arrogance of, I mean, it's just obvious to me. People say to me, oh, don't say that too much, you know, Janara, don't talk about the dominant culture too much. But the fact is, there is an arrogance in the dominant culture that doesn't allow people who have knowledge, who might be people of colour or from other places, to come in and be part of the power structure of collaboration and partnerships. And I think we need to just get rid of that in order for us all to work together as humans, you know, to help each other do this well. So I think universities are great places for that, because that's been my experience every time I've been a student at a university or a teacher at a university. You know, the collaboration that can happen across the faculties and across First Nations and non-First Nations people has just been a great experience for me in my career, for sure.
Thanks, Janara, and thanks, Denisha. Just mindful of the time, I have a question that I want to ask before we finish, but I'll just acknowledge there is a question from Sam in the chat just about what people can do to support, I guess, support elevating Indigenous voices and work towards real action. And I think I'm probably safe in saying that from what both of you have said, really what people can do is make sure they're properly consulting with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they're involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations in decision making. I think that's a key thing that's come through from this conversation today. So I think if you're doing anything with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that will affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to involve us right from the get-go. Don't think of us as an afterthought. Think of us from the start when you're planning. Yeah. Well, thank you both for such a great conversation. I really just wanted to ask this question before we finished up, and I think it's a really interesting question. You might have already provided an answer to it, but I'm interested to hear what some of the key changes, or if there's one key change that you're really hoping to make if you were to be elected into Parliament. So if there's this sort of a topic or a policy that you're really keen in being involved in, sort of forming or changing at the moment, is there something that's really, really at the top of your list?
For sure. So I've got so many at the top of that list.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
At the top of that list. There's no hierarchy of all my needs for transforming the country and making it better for all of us. But I think, you know, there are increments, there are things you can do just the way the system is established. You have to do it a step at a time. And so for me, the idea of sovereignty and self-determination at a really powerful level that's equitable and equal between two nations now has to be ironed out. And so, you know, we have not made any domestic policy for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in Australia. And that has to happen. That has to happen if I'm talking about the most important policy in First Nations stuff, because out of that comes, you know, if we have a voice to Parliament, which is Council of Elders or whatever it's going to be, if we have a treaty, if we have a Truth and Justice Commission, whatever, these things have to be under the umbrella of international law that recognises our sovereignty, which is equal to the sovereignty of those who came and took our country. And that is just something that is a wrong that has to be absolutely righted. So in First Nations policy, that's my first and absolute thing. But in terms of the whole broad general part of Australia, I think the whole system needs transformation so that the needs of people and communities, those voices are first in everything we do. And that the corrupt system that happens in Parliament House, we need an integrity commission at a very high level in the federal government, because there's too much going on that's wrong, that's not giving our communities across the whole nation, all of our communities, the things that they need to live and survive and be well and happy. So I guess those two things are really important to me.
And I guess from my perspective, my electorate's very elderly. I've been doing a lot of door knocking, a lot of phone calls as well too. So a lot of the issues that are coming through are around, you know, unaffordability of healthcare. And I've got a health background, I'm working in health. So it is those issues around being able to live at home, aged care packages, support packages, and wait lists. And I had a disability forum last week with Bill Shorten. He came up and talked to, you know, talking about systems that are fragmented and, you know, in crisis. You know, healthcare, aged care, disability services, you know, there's a whole heap of work that needs to be done. So, you know, obviously that's my passion going forward. In terms of our agenda as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's around enactioning Uluru Statement from the Heart and committing to that, seeing that done.
Great. Well, thank you both. It's 5:55 now, so we might start to wrap up. I want to just first of all thank all the people in the audience. There were some fantastic questions and a lot of questions came through, and there's one or two which we couldn't get to just with time constraints. But thanks to everybody for all the questions and engaging. And I just really wanted to thank you both, Janara and Denisha, for joining us today. I know you're both extremely busy and things will get busier as we get closer to an election being called. It's budget week. So I assume you also both have plenty of stuff going on along with your full-time jobs as well. Yeah, I really, really want to thank you both for coming and also just continuing to engage in the ANU community as well. I think, I know me personally, I really appreciate like pretty much all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander alumni. I think we're all such a good bunch of people. And I just love being able to sort of facilitate these sort of conversations. And this is the second year we've done this. And last year we had a good conversation about racism in sport. So hopefully we can continue to do this in future alumni weeks as well, because I think it's important to have the conversations, but I also just love being able to highlight what great things our alumni are doing as well. So thank you both for coming along and having a chat today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Good to
Thank
see
you.
Denisha and
All the
Frank.
best, Janara.
Yes, and good luck.
You
I
too.
hope to see you there in the big house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care.
Well, thanks everyone, and we might conclude the conversation now, but thanks everybody in the audience as well for joining us.